Before we get to the story, I'd like to say thanks so much for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading cosmic horror related stories every single day. So if that sounds good, please drop a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a lot, especially when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. Data processing work for a space program sounds more glamorous than it is, which I say without complaint, because the gap between the glamour and the reality is what I liked about it. The reality was a monitor, a processing pipeline, and a steady stream of raw data from a small autonomous rover making its way across the lunar surface at a pace that made a garden snail look ambitious. The rover covered about 200 meters on a good day, depending on terrain, and it produced imagery and sensor data continuously. And my job was to sit with that data and turn it into something the science team could use. It was quiet and technical and largely invisible work, the kind that keeps a program running without anyone above a certain level knowing your name. And I had been doing it for 2 years when the anomaly appeared in the radar returns. The program was a commercial lunar mapping operation, one of the second-generation private space ventures that had emerged in the years after the major agency programs demonstrated that the moon was accessible to non-government actors with sufficient capital and patience. The company I worked for had a contract with a consortium of space agencies and private clients to produce high-resolution terrain data for a section of the lunar mare, the flat ancient basalt plains that covered large portions of the near side in preparation for future mission planning. The rover was the tool, a compact vehicle loaded with cameras and spectrometers and a ground-penetrating radar system that could profile the subsurface to a depth of several meters, looking for void spaces and subsurface features that surface imagery alone couldn't reveal. Ground-penetrating radar on the moon had a particular value that it didn't have on Earth, because the moon's surface had no water and no biological activity, and very little of the geological process that complicated radar returns on Earth. The signal went in clean and came back clean, and the subsurface profiles it produced were among the most interpretable radar data in planetary science. I had processed enough of it to have a feel for what normal lunar subsurface looked like in the returns, the characteristic layering of the regolith, the occasional harder substrate beneath, the random distribution of buried rock fragments from ancient impact events. The return from the anomaly didn't look like any of that. It appeared on a Thursday in a routine traverse section that the rover's path planning had taken it across as part of a standard grid survey of the assigned mapping area. I was running the standard processing sequence on the day's radar data when the return came up in the flagging algorithm as a subsurface feature of interest, which was the algorithm's way of saying that something in the data sat outside the parameters of normal geological variation. I pulled it up and looked at it directly, which was always the next step after an algorithmic flag, and I looked at it for a while before I put it in the queue for science team review. The return was dense and regular in a way that natural subsurface features weren't. Natural features had the irregular profiles of things that got where they are through geological process, the randomness of impacts and flow, and the accumulations of material over time. This had the acoustic profile of something solid and consistent, a geometry that held its shape across the entire lateral extent of the radar return, which covered about 12 meters of the traverse path. A rectangular profile, approximately, and I was careful about that word in my flag notes because rectangular is not a word you write in a geological data report without being sure, but it was the right word, and I used it. The science team came back to me within an hour of the flag going into the queue, which was faster than the normal review turnaround, and which I noted without drawing conclusions. The senior scientist, a man named Overton, whose name was on most of the program's published work, called me directly rather than sending a review note through the standard channel. He asked me to walk him through the processing steps I'd applied to the radar data before flagging, which was a reasonable quality assurance question, and which I answered completely. He asked whether I had applied any enhancement filters that might have introduced the apparent regularity into the return, which was also a reasonable question, and the answer was no. He said they were going to commission a follow-up pass over the anomaly coordinates and that I should flag the data from that pass for immediate review when it came through. The follow-up pass happened on the following Monday. The rover redirected from its planned traverse to make 2 additional radar sweeps over the anomaly location at different angles. The returns from both sweeps were consistent with the original, the same dense regular profile from both angles, which ruled out the directional artifacts that radar geometry could sometimes produce and which the science team had apparently been hoping to find as an explanation. The object was real. Overton called me again after the follow-up pass review and said the team was working on the geological interpretation and that I should continue normal processing on the rest of the data queue. He said it in a way that indicated the conversation was concluded, and I continued normal processing and spent the rest of that week thinking about what I'd seen in the returns. The thinking led me somewhere that I should probably have left alone, but leaving things alone has never been a strength of mine when the thing in question is a data problem I don't have the answer to. I pulled the anomaly's depth from the radar return calculations. The object was buried at a depth that the rover's radar system could resolve at its maximum penetration capability. The deepest layer, the system was designed to image reliably, not comfortably within the system's range, not shallowly buried, where any radar would have found it. Right at the edge of what the system could see, the depth at which the signal strength was just sufficient to return a usable profile. I checked the penetration specifications for every previous lunar ground-penetrating radar system that had operated on or around the Moon, going back to the early orbital radar sounders from the 1970s. Each system had a different penetration capability depending on its frequency and power, and the history of lunar radar was a history of progressively improving penetration depth as the technology developed. I plotted the maximum penetration depth of each system against the burial depth of the object. Every previous system fell short. The orbital sounders from the 70s, the radar instruments on subsequent lunar orbiters, the surface radar experiments from the early rover programs, every single one of them would have looked at this section of the lunar mare and seen nothing, the object sitting just below the depth they could resolve. The system on our rover, the current generation, was the first to have sufficient penetration to see it. The object had been buried at the precise depth that our technology had just become capable of reaching. Not approximately, not within a rough range. The burial depth corresponded to our system's maximum penetration capability with a precision that I calculated 3 times before I accepted the number, and each calculation came back the same. Whatever was buried there had been placed at the exact depth that would make it invisible to everything that came before us, and visible to us now with the specific technology we had recently developed. Something had known what we would build. I sat with that for a long time. I'm a data analyst, and the data had led me to a conclusion, and I sat with the conclusion and worked through the implications of it until I was confident I wasn't making an error. And then I sat with it some more, because being confident you're not making an error and being ready to tell someone what the data is saying are two different things, when what the data is saying is what this data was saying. I put it in a memo to Overton, laid out the depth analysis, the comparison against historical system capabilities, the conclusion that the object's burial depth corresponded with a specificity that ruled out coincidence to the penetration limit of our current system and no prior system. I wrote it in the same careful technical language I used for everything, and I sent it through the standard internal channel, and I waited. Overton called me the same afternoon. He said the depth analysis was interesting and that the science team would incorporate it into their geological interpretation work. He said it in the voice of someone who had already decided how they were going to handle something and was managing the source of the information rather than engaging with it. 2 days after the memo, the program's government liaison contacts got involved. The program had always had government liaison involvement, which was standard for commercial operations with implications for national space policy, and the liaison contacts had always been a background presence, attending quarterly reviews and receiving copies of significant findings. Their response to the anomaly was not background. 2 of them arrived at the company's facility in person, which they had never done for any previous finding in the program's history, and spent 2 days in meetings with the program's leadership that I was not invited to, and that produced a reclassification of the anomaly in the program's official record. The anomaly was reclassified as a geological feature consistent with a dense subsurface impact melt deposit, a natural formation that high-density radar returns could resemble under certain processing conditions. The reclassification document cited additional analysis that I was not given access to, and that contradicted the data I had processed directly. It was wrong. The data didn't support it, and I knew the data better than anyone involved in producing the reclassification had any opportunity to know it. An impact melt deposit didn't produce the regular geometry the returns showed. An impact melt deposit didn't have the lateral consistency across 12 meters of traverse that the object's profile had. The reclassification was a decision rather than a finding, and the decision had been made by people whose involvement in the program's science had never before extended to overriding the science team's interpretations. Before my system access was restricted, which happened in stages over the week following the reclassification, I pulled the object's precise surface coordinates and cross-referenced them against the historical photographic archive of the lunar surface. Every orbital and surface photography mission that had covered that section of the mare, going back to the earliest reconnaissance programs. The surface above the object's burial location appeared in photographs going back decades. I was looking for anything that might mark the location any surface feature that correlated with what was beneath it. And I found it in an image from an early lunar reconnaissance mission, a subtle but consistent topographic feature at the surface directly above the burial site, a slight regularity in the otherwise flat mare surface that appeared in every photographic survey of the region and that I had never seen referenced in any geological description of the area. A marker, surface visible, subtle enough to be read as a natural feature by anyone who wasn't looking for it, consistent enough across decades of photography to have always been there. Whatever buried the object had marked it, had put something on the surface above it that was visible from orbit, visible in every photograph ever taken of that section of the mare, waiting for someone to know what they were looking at. We'd been photographing the marker for decades without knowing it was a marker. My employment with the program ended 3 weeks after the reclassification, described in the company's communication as a role elimination resulting from a program restructuring that reduced the data processing team's size. The restructuring affected one position, mine. The rover program continues. The mare mapping project is ongoing. The reclassified anomaly is in the program's geological database as a subsurface impact melt deposit at the coordinates I originally flagged, and anyone who looks at that database entry sees a geological feature rather than what the data showed me. I've thought about what to make of the conclusion the data produced for a long time now, and what I keep coming back to is the depth. The burial depth is the part I can't explain away or soften into ambiguity. It's the part that has a number attached to it, a precise and verifiable number that I calculated correctly, and that means what it means regardless of what any reclassification document says about it. Something buried an object on the moon at a depth that would be invisible to every technology we had until recently, and visible to the technology we developed within the last few decades. That depth is not geological. Geological processes don't bury objects at depths calibrated to the penetration limits of radar systems that didn't exist when the object was buried. Whatever put it there understood our technological trajectory, understood that we would eventually develop ground-penetrating radar capable of that depth, understood that we would eventually send it to the moon. Understood, in other words, something about us and our development that implies an observation of us over a long enough period and at a close enough range to make accurate predictions, and then it left something for us to find at exactly the moment we became capable of finding it. I don't know what the object is. The radar returns gave me its profile and its depth, and nothing about its contents. I don't know if we're meant to retrieve it, or simply to know it's there. I don't know if the moment of finding it was the point, the confirmation that we'd reached a certain technological threshold, or if the finding is supposed to lead to something else. I don't know if it's a gift. I don't know if it's a warning. I know it's been there longer than we've had anything capable of finding it, and that it was placed by something that knew we would, and that whatever that something understood about us, it understood it well enough to be right.